I'm Kevin Blevins, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Siemens Startup Podcast Series, where we speak with entrepreneurs to gain insight on how they turn their innovative dreams into successful companies. Today, I'll be talking with someone who understands the startup community and has approached this industry from a number of different angles. It's hard to talk about the startup community and not talk about the courageous few that lead the charge and start these companies. A lot of people create companies with great ideas, and once they've experienced the workload, the pace it takes to start and build a company, they say, I'll never do it again. And then there's others who start one company, and then something seems to get into their blood, so they start another company and another, and they become serial entrepreneurs, so to speak. Our guest today appears to be in the latter group. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Francis Pallara, the founder and former director of strategy and development for Urban Movement Labs. Francis is on the board of UML now, but Urban Movement Labs is a first of its kind collaboration between local government and innovators, all committed to the same vision, a Los Angeles where new transportation technologies are tested, proven, and brought to life. As you would expect, they are based in the Los Angeles area. I'm excited to learn more about Urban Movement Labs, but first, let's get started by learning more about our guest. Hello, Francis, and wonderful to speak with you. Very much appreciate you taking the time to join me.
Hey, Kevin, it's good to be with you.
So, Francis, can we start with learning more about yourself? Perhaps you can introduce yourself. Tell us about your background, how you got started, and what has brought you to where you are today.
That can be a long story, but I'll try to pare it down a little bit. I grew up in Los Angeles, started out my career in entertainment as a film producer and music video producer. Really was interested in media entertainment and film for the good chunk of the beginning of my career. But at the same time as that industry digitized and kind of moved on from more traditional formats, I sought to explore other things and quickly transitioned into advertising as an agency producer, then a project manager, product manager, and found my way into tech. Launched a venture capital fund in Santa Monica that focused on early stage tech startups and invested in several dozen companies there. Through that time, I had also launched a few businesses, one of which I actually exited in 2019, which was a media company and newsletter. After that, I had an interest in transportation and mobility. I think part of my experience growing up is I'm Jordanian and Italian, and my parents were immigrants, so my family were still living in both countries. And in the summer, I had the good fortune of being able to go visit my family every year until I was maybe the age of 15. And in that, I experienced a whole different way of getting around and experiencing a city that was different from the way that I was able to experience Los Angeles. So growing up in LA, had always had this idea in the back of my mind of how different the public transit system was there and how easy it was to get around as a 12-year-old kid, even in a third world country like Jordan. But at the same time, in LA, we didn't really have a system in place that enabled that. And that frustration always was kind of felt and wanted to find a way to have an impact in that space. And the opportunity started to present itself in about 2016, 2017. We started seeing more startups building technologies in the transportation space. There was sort of a convergence of computing capability, semiconductors, energy density and batteries and battery technology, and also connectivity that enabled companies like Bird to create a free-floating scooter share service. And soon thereafter, several other companies started entering the space that I was working with and advising, which led to an opportunity to join Mayor Eric Garcetti's office as an entrepreneur in residence and fellow to help them find ways to be more embracing of new technology and build pathways for those solutions, understanding that cities are typically reactive to new technology and can move at a very slow pace. They wanted to address that and find a way to solve that problem. So that was really the kind of inception of Urban Movement Lab through that work. as an EIR for the mayor, built the Urban Movement Lab concept with Julia Thane, who was also working in the Office of Economic Development. And we've been operating for the past 3 years and have had a significant impact in the transportation space. And, I'm very fortunate to have been able to do this work and to participate in this way and help facilitate new technology actually being deployed in communities in a way that is both effective and embraces their needs and addresses critical issues that we're seeing across the system.
That is amazing. And when I listen to your story and all the different points that you just made, it poses a ton of questions. And I've not been to Jordan, but I have been to Europe and I've experienced the transportation system in Europe. So I understand where you're coming from. And I've often wondered myself, why can't we have something like that as well? So how many companies have you started?
I've started 3 independent companies of my own, different formations, and then I've launched 2 different businesses underneath existing corporates. So call it a department, let's say, or a new business team.
So you've done a few. And I've heard from friends, by the way, that have parents who have started companies and eventually they go and do the same. It's almost as though they had entrepreneur blood in their family. Is this something that happened with you, or are you the first one to go do this?
No, actually, that isn't the case for me. My father was a telecommunications engineer and researcher for NASA. He led most of the research that was being done out of JPL in that space. My mother is a nursing practitioner and professor who had worked at UCLA, Azusa Pacific, Cal State Northridge, but their backgrounds are in medicine and engineering and science. And, I was kind of the first, at least recently, to venture into building businesses and, launching a startup.
What do you think is the appeal to creating the startup? Is it similar to what I mentioned earlier, where it just seems to get into your blood and you move in that direction, or is it something else?
I think that there's been a popularity, of course, in recent years, just given the stories and visibility that you're seeing from founders. There are different motivations, I think, for different people. But for me, I think more about whether or not I see this problem being addressed and whether or not I feel that I have the best capabilities and skill set to execute. And usually if I find a fit, that's where, I'll become very emboldened and passionate about a particular idea and will want to see it come to life. You give up things along the way, you make sacrifices, but the learning experience and the impact you can have by building even a small business, whether it amounts to a unicorn exit or not, I think is still worthy of the effort. I really enjoy that environment, and maybe it is something that is kind of ingrained in me at this point, but after you do it a few times, I think it becomes a little bit more second nature to understanding what are the key components early on and how you can build more traction as a business owner.
I think the one thing that really stood out, and that there are parts of it that you enjoy, but the learning experience. I consider myself a lifelong learner. So I feel like if I'm not learning something, I'm going to go do something different. And so I completely understand that piece. You also mentioned, as you were talking in your background, your entrepreneur in residence. What does that mean? Is that a common position in governments today?
I don't know that I would consider it common in governments, but I think there's some new popularity in governments understanding that the pace of innovation and new technology being deployed in free public right of way or on city infrastructure is rapidly accelerating. And I think especially larger municipalities are aware of the fact that they need to be changing their thinking and having people on staff that are looking proactively ahead at how those technologies could be implemented and what sort of policies need to be developed in advance of those technologies being deployed. So we're starting to see more entrepreneurial type roles pop up in cities and government, but the EIR position is a title that is typically used in venture funds and or within innovation groups within a large corporation that are is a role designed to bring someone with an entrepreneurial mindset to come in and have an external perspective on a problem or a challenge and address it as if they were launching a business or helping scale some sort of operation within that business. There are many different flavors beyond that, but that's kind of the way I would define it.
And you mentioned you worked for a couple of venture funds in the past. Is this something you feel like you want to do in the future as well?
My opinion is that VC is always there for me to fall back on and come back to. I definitely enjoyed being a VC and participating in the deals that I saw. At any time, you might be looking at several hundred decks per month. So you're getting quite a good sense of what's being deployed in the market and what's working and what business models have been able to achieve success through that process. So it's, I think, definitely an interesting position to be in. However, I also think that I sort of reflected on, getting jaded within this space and spending too much time as a VC without going out and operating and learning. And it's important to kind of have that balance, in my opinion. So my goal would be to spend a few years operating and building and maybe a few years coming back to VC and alternating throughout my career. So yeah, and in the process of, having left the original fund that I had started, I've worked with other VCs as a subject matter expert for diligence, and that, has allowed me to keep one foot in the door.
I can relate to that whole fallback idea. I had a similar point in my career where I was an engineer and doing engineer work and decided it wasn't something I wanted to do the rest of my life. So I understand that. But having that fallback almost gives you the courage or gives you permission to then go out and try something new and learn something new. And again, I think that then goes back to the whole idea of the lifelong learner. I talked a bit about UML in the introduction, but I'm sure I didn't do it justice. Can you tell us a bit more about Urban Movement Labs and how it got started? What was the premise behind it and how it has grown into what it is today?
Yeah, Urban Movement Labs was initiated within the mayor's office. Our goal was to find ways to accelerate the process by which a city and the government can learn and have cross-functional participation across different agencies to learn about new technologies that are coming down the pipe. That kind of proactive nature isn't really part of typical governing models, and usually a government or agency is more responsive to some sort of issue that may occur. So similar to scooters being deployed in cities, they were deployed and then cities reacted and created policies retroactively. So, our goal here is to be more involved or make cities more involved in that process. And in going through that discovery, we did some significant research, speaking with different organizations internationally, actually, that have attempted similar things. And what we realized was that UML represented an opportunity to build a separate 501c3 nonprofit that had the ability to augment city government and agency authority in some cases, where we could enable the testing and deployment of new technology to better understand what sort of impact or effects it may have within the city, and take that information as a trusted third party to inform policy and regulation about that technology and create a pathway for that new solution to actually deploy and have a permitting process, if you will, to operate in the city. So double clicking into this concept of augmenting city authority is really what I found most interesting about the model. City governments are currently tasked with a tremendous amount of issues and needs, and the staff on hand are not going to be able to cover all of those simultaneously. And so there's going to be a future where cities are going to have to rely more heavily on trusted third parties to help facilitate, provide subject matter expertise, to help with the procurement process and identifying technologies and solutions that can address urgent challenges, representing the underrepresented communities across cities, especially in Los Angeles. And that's where I think UML has had the opportunity to shine. For instance, just to give you an example, we will test and deploy a solution, be it, let's say, a commercial loading automation for enforcement to make commercial loading in the urban core more efficient. In the process of deploying that technology and better understanding it, the city is actually getting the opportunity to look at this technology before having created a procurement process, which often requires them to create an RFP before they even know what the technology is capable of doing. And so in that situation, they're not really informed on how the technology could address a problem or how it really works. And in this case, we're sort of hacking that procurement process by giving them the visibility, the data, and awareness of what that tech can do so that they can accelerate the RFP process and get more traction being created within these issues that we need to address. And in particular, in Los Angeles, we have quite a bit of work to do between now and the Olympics. So there's a lot going on right now in LA.
There is indeed. When I think about city governments and things of that sort, I don't see them on the bleeding edge of taking advantage of technology. I see them more on, well, once the technology is perfected, then we can consider the technology in our cities. So I'm curious if there's a give and take in the thought processes of a city government when it comes to that.
It's not so much about being first. I think most agencies in Los Angeles would rather not be first, but they'd rather do it right. Unpacking how to do it right requires quite a bit of awareness, analysis, research, deployment, testing, and the city just isn't able to do that on its own. And that's where we step in. So we provide that as a resource and as a capacity building tool for the city. And we provide subject matter expertise that is staffed within the city so that they have people on hand to address really challenging questions for technologies that are operating in some cases for the first time. For example, advanced air mobility is quite a new type of technology. There isn't infrastructure already established for it, and it is anticipated to be in development or deployment in cities very soon. The city needs to think quite a bit about how they're going to respond to that industry and demand, and how they'll either regulate or participate in the process of land use, let's say, for where these vertiports might be located and how flying cars of the future are going to be utilized in the city as part of the public transit system. So yeah, it's more about doing it right and not necessarily being first there.
So this program that you've created related to advanced air mobility is one that piques my interest. I guess kind of a follow-up question related to that specifically is, how long do you think it's going to be before that technology will fly in our cities or fly over our cities for that matter?
This is a question we get often, and it's really hard to pin down exactly when we're going to see eVTOLs, electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, which are commonly referred to in the media as flying cars, in Los Angeles. What I can say is that some demonstrations are planned to be conducted during the Paris Olympics. And I think that'll be an interesting opportunity for people to see conceptually how flying cars might be implemented in a city. So that'll be an interesting and eye-opening experience. What I can also say is that a lot of these vehicles are being certified by the FAA already. So technically, they will be airworthy potentially by the end of the year. Whether that means that they'll be flying over cities like LA, that's, I think, still a question. Most likely what we'll see is various routes being tested from regional airports initially that may be interested in understanding how this new system could be integrated into their infrastructure. But I don't think we're going to be seeing real passenger transportation that is reliable until maybe 2028 at the earliest.
Yeah, I've heard different numbers from different locations or from different sources, and I agree with you. I think there's so much to go over. Can you maybe go into a little more detail on what a city or county area needs to think about when it comes to enabling these vehicles to fly?
Yeah, and actually, I'll try to cover a few points here, but there's a really great resource on our website called the Advanced Air Mobility Integration Primer. And it is a 80-page document that goes into depth on exactly what cities need to be considering, and in particular, work that we had done with LADOT and LADCP and other agencies in Los Angeles to try to understand what will be the process by which we're going to think about vertiport development and placement in a city. But this question is kind of complicated. There's a number of different factors, and I'll try to kind of lay them out. Basically, what's new about eVTOL technology is that it's relatively quiet compared to existing aviation or traditional aviation. And it has very little environmental impact because it is electric. It doesn't give off any sort of emission. So, in previous planning procedures, normally you would try to put an airport in the farthest area within a city to avoid impact of those kinds of negative externalities that come from an airport. And in this case, there are actually quite a bit of advantages, both in economic job creation and transport traffic flow through a waypoint, a vertiport, that could be advantageous to a community without having those negative externalities that would have come from an airport. It's kind of turning the whole concept on its head as to how cities would think about where to zone these vertiports and what the land use considerations would be. But yet there are a number of other factors, like what emergency services need to be within the vicinity to deal with a lithium ion fire. Is there the electrical grid capability at that infrastructure to support megawatt charging and rapid charging for repeated use throughout the day? What are the benefits to that position or location as far as integrating the rest of the public transit system? So there's a number of different ways and factors to look at how cities might consider what are the most important elements or their priorities when they're thinking about the land use, but that's one of the only factors that they actually control. So different from airports that the FAA controls, these are not federal property. They're zoned and the land use is permitted by city governments. So this is an interesting moment where city government is interacting with the FAA and the aviation industry in a way that they hadn't been in the past. It'll be really interesting to see how cities build policies around this new convergence.
And where do you see these VTOLs landing in the city?
What I would like to see is that we choose locations that are advantageous and effective for a broad majority of users. It'll take quite a bit of time before we see prices go down, but similar to Uber in its early days had Uber Black. The prices were not really supportive of an inclusive rider base. eVTOLs will eventually drop in price and become more accessible as a solution and really just create another option for that type of trip. We don't see it being the primary mode of transit for most people, but in a very heavily congested period of the day, and I know I need to get somewhere quickly, I might opt for utilizing an eVTOL. So with that in mind, those use cases in mind, and that kind of user experience that we'd like to have, I think that the industry really intends to have, we need to choose locations that integrate with the rest of the public transit system and have good mobility hubs for first last mile connectivity to enable a network that is actually productive and isn't just recreational or for a small population of users in the city.
The fact that you mentioned things like last mile that go along with it, I think that's amazing. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. But I believe UML is a nonprofit. Is that the case?
Yeah, we're a 501c3.
Yeah. Is there value in being a nonprofit when trying to bring government and transportation technology companies together to collaborate?
Yeah, I think we chose a nonprofit status because there's greater transparency, and our end constituent is actually members of the community, the people that utilize the transportation infrastructure that we're building. So it aligned appropriately with making sure that we're a trusted third space that city agencies can rely on and also ensuring that our impact goals are aligned with their goals in delivering solutions that are, addressing urgent mobility challenges and needs in the city. So it was kind of critical to be set up as a nonprofit.
It's interesting. I didn't realize that. In the introduction, I described UML as a first of its kind collaboration. Can you talk a bit about that?
So when we say first of its kind, this really touches on the idea that we had deployed what we call transportation technology innovation zones. These are, if you will, sandboxes where Urban Movement Labs has the ability to accelerate the process by which new technology can be deployed in those areas for more rapid iteration and learning. And that's where this collaboration between LADOT, Los Angeles airports, the Port of LA, and Metro has been a first of its kind, where the city has really embraced a third party to help facilitate the learning and early policy development advice or recommendations that can be made early on to accelerate that process. So we have our most prominent transportation technology innovation zone is in the Warner Center, which is a unique area that was a piece of land that was gifted to the city of LA several years ago and has a very individual plan from the rest of the Los Angeles area. And we saw it as an opportunity to test various technologies there, including solutions for road safety, vehicle autonomy, shuttle transport, and first last mile connectivity to the rapid transit line that exists there for Metro, and addressing actually one of the biggest issues that we have across the Southern California region is the reduction of vehicle miles traveled within small radiuses. So in Warner Center, it's similar to a downtown or a second downtown, if you will. It's an urban core. And in that core, a 3-mile radius, we see something like 70% of point-to-point traffic is within that small radius. And part of that is largely to do with the plan and the environment. These blocks are, if you thought of LA as kind of very large city blocks, these are like mega blocks. They have 3 lanes on either side of the road, so 6 lanes total. If you can imagine being a pedestrian walking almost the length of a football field just to get across one intersection, it's not really ideal for walkability. And every campus or facility there has a significant amount of parking. So it really encourages a point-to-point private vehicle sort of door-to-door experience. And, we know that the future is actually less car dominant and embraces other modes of transit that can provide options for those types of short trips. So this is an example. The Transportation Technology Innovation Zone is really the key example of this first of its kind collaboration. We, I think, have really proven how the city can benefit from the work that we can do for them. And I think that other cities are already in the process of replicating our model locally in their jurisdictions. And we're actively supporting the work that they're doing. So a number of our projects and programs that have been deployed in Los Angeles have been scaled to cities across the country where they've more or less implemented the same policy recommendations to deploy new technology in similar use cases that we had deployed here in LA. So I think that's where we can have quite a bit of scale and effect in addressing challenges that may appear in several cities across the country and accelerate that process for other DOTs.
Well, I think this is great. And I'm happy to hear that all of this information is being shared from city to city. When you talk about 6 lanes of road and what a pedestrian has to deal with going across that, you just described 3/4 of the intersections in Arizona. So at least everything that is anywhere close to me is identical to that.
Actually, planners will refer to Warner Center as LA's Arizona or LA's Phoenix.
Oh, interesting. Didn't know that. So I think people would be truly interested in knowing more about all the different programs at UML. And there are quite a few. Can you speak to how these programs were decided on?
Yeah, we developed programs really to address what we felt were technologies or spaces rather that new technology is being accelerated that can address a number of urgent mobility challenges in Los Angeles. There are a number of really effective solutions that have a very low cost to implement, using LiDAR at intersections for near miss detection and a dynamic analysis or forecast of potential fatalities at intersections and why that may occur. So, for example, this LiDAR system is akin to a camera, but doesn't have any sort of identifying features. It shoots out a little laser periodically, and that laser provides an image of where objects are in space at an intersection. That image can then be used to create a sort of synthetic copy or digital twin of that intersection. And we can start to dynamically change the intersections, either with or the timing of the light, or whether to protect a bike lane in that intersection. And by making those changes in a computerized environment, we can digitally identify how those changes will affect fatalities at an intersection and also reduce them, making that intersection safer for vulnerable users that may be taking more time to cross at a crosswalk. Putting parallel parking close to the intersection can cause abrupt maneuvers that can result in fatalities. And these types of systems can be very effective in reducing one of the most terrifying data points in our country as far as fatalities go, which is, vehicles and death to pedestrians. So that's just one example of something that can have a significant impact. Urban freight is also a huge, huge opportunity for urban environments where we can use more right-sized vehicles for the type of delivery that's occurring. So instead of taking a big box truck to deliver a few small boxes to the downtown area, a e-cargo bike could be utilized, reducing congestion, reducing emissions in that urban environment, and providing a vehicle that is more appropriate for that type of delivery method. We're starting to see this being deployed actually in New York. I believe there are some tests that they've been doing where a box truck will arrive at a corner parking lot and use that box truck as a mini distribution facility for a number of e-cargo bikes that will be deploying from that box truck. And those cargo bikes can go in different directions, covering the entire area. And those types of tests have proven to have a significant impact in the number of vehicles and the efficiency of that process. So those are just two examples that are areas where we think are really important for us to be helping cities understand how these technologies can be implemented.
That's great. And I think there are a couple more that I would like to bring up as well, and that is the robotics and autonomy. And I'm curious, what do cities have to do to make these robotic boxes share the sidewalks with humans?
Yeah, I think early on, our work was more centered around what are the considerations that need to be made when having a pedestrian sidewalk be used to share space with new traffic. They weren't really designed for robots to be roaming around on the curb. So we had to consider other users, ADA compliance, and the businesses, and try to figure out a way in which that space could be shared. So things like considering the speed of the robot are important and how they may be parked or stored on curb space. But cities don't necessarily need to do much. They need to create a policy. They need to make clear rules for companies to operate in an environment safely. But beyond that, these robots are somewhat operating like cars on the road, just that they're driving on a curb. And one advantage to our work in the process of doing our testing is that we realized most of these robots have onboard cameras. And with those cameras, we were able to actually create an asset data set of the curb, the condition of the curb. And curbs are a lot more dynamic than one may think. Bus seats and signs and parking spaces and benches are all getting moved and rotated on the curb quite frequently. And the city doesn't really have context to what the curb environment looks like regularly. So these robots are actually driving across the curb and are able to report, large cracks in the curb where there could be an injury due to a tree lifting concrete in an area, or scooters that are being deployed incorrectly on the curb could be enforced through that information, or even just maintenance in general that Bureau of Street Services needs to consider. are all pieces of data that are now being captured and are part of that policy that we helped advise. So now the city has a new data set of what the curb looks like and how they may be able to respond to those needs.
And I think that when it comes to these robots, their technology that's in the robots being fully autonomous is going to have to, I think it's going to have to be fully autonomous. I don't see how it could work any other way. And I can relate to curb changes. I come from Michigan originally, and whether it's the water, whether it's the freezing of concrete, it impacts those curbs and they change on a regular basis. And not to mention the whole idea of snow and what snow means to these kind of delivery devices. All of that's going to have to be worked out. But at the same time, I'm happy to see that a lot of it's occurring. There were a couple of programs that I wasn't quite sure about. And the first of those is it's the asset management. Don't most cities have asset management systems today for maintenance, repair, and overhaul, what we'd call MRO systems?
Yeah, they do. And I think the question is, to what degree is that data available or presented in a way that can be utilized to make critical decisions? And the other part of it is they need to continually be capturing data and enforcing the asset space. So asset management incorporates partly what we just discussed. Capturing the data from those robots is a form of asset management. We're collecting data on the condition of the curb, but also curb management, referring to the example I provided earlier about commercial loading and how commercial vehicles might use curb space, or how curb space could be dynamically utilized in some areas, is another form of asset management. And there are a lot of new tools that are being developed to enable the automated enforcement of those environments and to create dynamic policies that drivers can utilize to use space in a more efficient way. So, for example, there are several blocks in the Warner Center area that might be completely painted yellow or red. In a dynamic environment, those sections of the block may only need to be yellow or red during certain times of the day or certain days of the week. And in other cases can be green for a 20-minute parking environment or some other condition. But they can also be managed in a dynamic pricing way, or this data could be used to prevent congestion in the urban core with a congestion pricing model. There are a number of different ways that the asset management tools can help inform or provide better resources for agencies to create a better experience in our cities.
Yeah, this makes more sense to me now. Well, switching gears a bit here, the Urban Movement Labs and Siemens has a collaboration agreement. Is there something particular about Siemens that prompted UML to create this relationship?
Well, I think Siemens is a phenomenal organization that has been working on a really broad array of technologies, both in building digital tools that enable early development, prototyping, and analysis of solutions, but also working with the energy, microgrid, aviation teams that have been developing new solutions to help get regional airports prepared for the electrical demand that's going to happen in less than a decade in their environments where they may not be able to get what they need from the grid on their own. And there's an opportunity there to develop new solutions. So I think Siemens has been a company that's been really on the cutting edge of a lot of transportation and mobility technologies and needs. And I think we were very happy to collaborate with you all and participate in helping deploy those solutions.
Yeah, and in case anybody's listening to this and wondering what we're talking about, there's a webinar series called Humans of New Mobility. We recorded 2 of those already, and I think we've got a couple more that we're looking at doing in the future. So if someone's out there and wants to know more about that, I'll mention the website in a few minutes. So Francis, where do you see Urban Movement Labs going in the next 12 months?
That's an interesting question. I think, we as a board have kind of come to reflecting on the past 3 years of operating and as a young startup nonprofit, considering where to scale and grow and how to expand the work that we do and the impact that we deliver. And We don't really have an answer to that question, but in my mind's eye, I would like to see Urban Movement Labs be able to expand nationally and have a more direct involvement with programs and projects on the ground in various states. I think we could do more in workforce development, and there's an essential need in upskilling the workforce that's only going to increase in the next few years. I think we ideally would like to have programs in place to create an apprenticeship model or some sort of training environment that helps to certify individuals who have trade skills in a particular field to enter into a new technology. Those are some of our, I think, long vision goals or long-term goals that we would like to see Urban Movement Labs fulfilling.
You've been creating companies, you've been working at startup companies, working at venture capital companies for many years. What advice or words of wisdom would you offer to budding entrepreneurs and or people thinking about starting a company or even working at a startup company?
The best advice I could give is actually kind of counterintuitive to entrepreneurs who haven't built a business this way, but building in public is kind of an essential tool that I utilize now and helps to build a community around the product that you're deploying and the business that you're building. Building in public is just really as simple as it sounds. Sharing what your progress has been, talking about the learnings that you've gathered over the iteration phases of your alpha product or beta product. I think that it can be really effective to be more vocal. And I see a lot of founders more interested in kind of keeping their business private, not really sharing what they're working on. And I think that can be ultimately a negative in how they may develop relationships with investors or find the right team members to help build this product. There's a lot of momentum and energy that can be created from building in public. Aside from that, I think find advisors early on that you trust and have the appropriate skill set to help you address some of the unknown unknowns that you'll experience along the way. The less that you have to make those mistakes yourself, the less that you'll have to work your way out of them and spend time resolving them. So it's always more efficient to have people who've been there and done it before. But those are probably the two top tips I would impart to a new founder.
Some common thoughts from some other people that we have talked about. Advisors is one of those things that always comes up, or getting that right advice. And it can come from just the startup community in general, or it could come from an incubator or someone like that. So I think there's a number of options there. I have to ask this question. Do you have any plans to create another company soon?
I don't think that part of my brain ever shuts off completely. So yes, I am working on a project now. I'm kind of perpetually working on a project until I either decide it's no longer of interest to me or, not a good enough mousetrap or whatever the case may be. But I'm currently working on something, and I will have to maybe follow up with you in a future podcast to tell you what it's about.
That would be exciting, and we would love to have you do that. We are, however, coming to the end of our time together today. But before we go, do you have any thoughts or comments you would like to share with our audience related to Urban Movement Labs or yourself? Other things perhaps that we didn't talk about that you would like them to know?
I think we covered a lot of ground. I would say, if you're listening and you have any questions about, government relations, working with city governments, policies, or you have a new technology that you'd like to get a better sense of what might be some of the potential considerations you need to make as you scale, don't hesitate to reach out. You can always email us at info@urbanmovementlabs.org, and we'd be happy to see where we can be supportive.
Well, Francis, I'd like to thank you for joining the conversation today. It has been a pleasure talking with you. I've enjoyed learning more about Urban Movement Labs and the collaboration between local government and innovators. I found it very interesting, and I appreciate you sharing your perspective on the interactive workshops and activities that you've got going on. And of course, the webinars, talking about the webinars related to Humans of New Mobility series that Siemens is sponsoring with you. And your comments related to being an entrepreneur and the things that people should be thinking about if that's what they're interested in doing. I think those were spot on as well.
It's my pleasure to be on the podcast, Kevin. Thank you so much for having me, and really appreciate the questions.
For our listeners, if you want to know more about Urban Movement Labs or listen in on the Humans of New Mobility series, please go to their website. It's www.urbanmovementlabs, that labs is plural, and that's all one word, .org. I also want to thank everyone for listening to today's podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with Francis and learning more about Urban Movement Labs. As a reminder, Siemens does offer special packaging and pricing for small to medium-sized startup companies on nearly all areas of our software portfolio. If you'd like to know more about this, please visit the Siemens website at www.siemens.com/software for startups, all one word, or speak with any of the Siemens partners. They know a ton about it as well, or you can reach out to myself. Thanks again for listening to the Siemens Startup Podcast. Please feel free to provide comments on this episode by leaving a review, or feel free to email me at kevin.blevins@siemens.com. This is your host, Kevin Blevins. Remember, innovation has no boundaries.